Cold air settled over the compound like a warning, crawling across the dirt and rising into the thin morning light. Frost clung to the fence lines, turning the wires pale as breath drifted from every soldier and prisoner who stepped into the open. The camp moved slowly at dawn, but this morning carried a stillness that did not belong. Women gathered near low wooden huts with their shoulders hunched, their eyes sharp, their movements too careful for routine. Something was being hidden, something fragile. American guards noticed the shift first. A pattern had broken. The roll call lines were uneven. Mothers standing just out of place, arms pressed tightly against their bodies, as if guarding more than their own ribs. Beneath worn coats and rough blankets, small shapes shifted. A faint movement here, a muffled sound there, too soft to be called crying, too desperate to be ignored. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain whether to step forward or keep distance. No orders had been given, but instinct told them not to push. The women, pale from months of captivity, watched every motion from the Americans as though the slightest approach might shatter the fragile lives hidden under cloth. A rumor spread through the rows like a cold wind. Someone whispered that the soldiers had noticed. Someone else whispered that discovery meant the babies would be taken away. Mothers tightened their grips, drawing their makeshift bundles closer, shielding them beneath elbows and folded coats. Fear sharpened their faces. Even the slightest sound from the huts made them flinch. No one said what everyone felt. Punishment was expected. Why else would Americans walk so slowly? Why else would they study the women with such steady eyes? Yet nothing happened. No orders, no shouting. Only the quiet question that rose in every mind. Why were these mothers so terrified of being seen with their own children? Subscribe for more real history humanitarian stories. The women gathered close to one another as the morning settled into its quiet rhythm, forming small circles near the huts where the cold could not reach their voices. Their whispers trembled like threads pulled too tight. Each word meant only for the ears of those who already feared the same things. Beneath worn blankets, the infants shifted softly, unaware of the danger their mothers believed hovered over them. The warnings came back in fragments, lessons spoken in dark rooms long before capture, wrapped in certainty and whispered like scripture. They had been told that foreign doctors would take a child not to heal it, but to use it, question it, or erase it if it served no purpose. Some believed the babies would be taken to force information from their mothers. Others feared they would be separated forever, punished for simply being born in the wrong moment of war. These stories had no single source, no clear truth, yet they lived inside the women as firmly as memory itself. One mother pressed her cheek to the top of her bundle, eyes fixed on the American medical tent where a lantern still glowed from the early shift. She imagined cold metal instruments, harsh hands a child pulled from her grasp. Another mother shuddered at the idea of being asked to unveil her infant to strangers, to show the bruises, the thin arms, the fragile skin that betrayed how long fear had replaced nourishment. Yet across the yard, the American medics moved with quiet steadiness. They checked supplies, arranged blankets, prepared warm water. Their faces carried no urgency, no suspicion, only the tired calm of men accustomed to tending the wounded. They did not push forward or call the women out by name. They simply waited, unaware that every gentle motion deepened the women's confusion. The mothers clutched their children tighter, torn between the myths they had memorized and the silence of the doctors who had yet to approach. In that space between belief and reality, fear held its ground. The lead doctor stood just outside the medical tent, arms loosely folded, letting the cold morning settle around him as he watched the camp shift into motion. He did not call out or signal for the women to come forward. Instead, he studied the small details that revealed more than any report could. Shoulders held too tightly, eyes that followed every movement with guarded suspicion, blankets clutched with a desperation that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. And beneath those blankets, the faintest motions, infants moving as though uncertain of the world they had entered. He noticed how thin the bundles seemed, how rarely a baby's cry slipped through, how the women's hands trembled not only from the cold, but from something deeper, something that tightened their throats and forced them to shrink back whenever an American came into view. Even when the guards stood still, the mothers flinched as if bracing for a command that never came. He had seen distrust before, but this was different. These mothers were not protecting themselves. They were protecting lives too fragile to be shown. The doctor felt a knot form under his ribs as he tried to measure the distance between duty and humanity. Protocol demanded clear identification of all dependents, records, health checks, verification. But compassion pulled him toward another truth. Pushing forward now would tear open a wound that had barely begun to heal. He watched one woman shift her blanket, revealing a glimpse of a tiny hand, pale and unmoving, until she covered it again with shaking fingers. Another rocked slightly, not to soothe the child, but to calm her own rising panic. Every gesture told him what words had not. They feared him as much as they feared the war that had placed them here. He took a breath and held his position. Sometimes the first act of care was restraint, the willingness to wait until terror loosened its grip. So he stayed where he was, silent, patient, letting the women see that he would not force his way into their fear. Their fear had not been born in this camp. It had traveled with them, carried across collapsing cities and ruined roads, whispered in cellars, shelters, and barracks as the world they knew shrank into hunger and smoke. In the quiet spaces between patrols, the mothers remembered those warnings now, lessons shaped by a dying empire that needed fear to hold its people together as everything else fell apart. They had been told that foreign soldiers would use children as leverage, that an infant's cry could become a weapon against its own mother. Some had heard that captors would take a child away until the mother confessed to information she did not even have. Others were taught that babies born during war were unwanted burdens, and any sign of weakness could invite punishment or separation. None of these stories had proof behind them. They lived instead in the anxious imaginations of civilians trapped between orders and survival. Shame had been woven into those lessons. A woman who showed fear was considered fragile. A mother who admitted she needed help risked being seen as unfit. Vulnerability was a private condition, never to be shown before strangers, especially not before men in foreign uniforms. Even safety, when offered, was something to approach with suspicion, as though kindness itself might be a trap. Here in the camp, those teachings echoed with every heartbeat. When an American soldier looked toward a blanket-covered bundle, the women remembered warnings of exposure, of being forced to uncover what was theirs to protect. When a doctor stepped closer, they felt the weight of stories about examinations meant to shame, not heal. Their instincts had been shaped by fear long before they arrived, reinforced by months of running, hiding, and holding life against their chests in the dark. War had stripped them of certainty. It had taught them that showing vulnerability, even in a moment of need, was dangerous, and so they clung to their children with the fierce quiet of those who believed the world might take everything if they loosened their grip by even an inch. The medics approached with slow, deliberate steps, carrying blankets folded neatly across their arms and small tins of formula warmed over a low flame. Their intentions were clear in every movement. Gentle, careful, shaped by long months of tending to wounded soldiers who needed steady hands more than reassuring words. But intention meant little in the face of fear that had been carved into the mothers long before captivity. The moment the first medic neared the huts, the women pulled back as if struck by a sudden blast of cold wind. Blankets tightened, shoulders lifted, their bodies turned inward, creating a wall of arms and fabric meant to hide the smallest shapes beneath them. The infants stirred uneasily, as if sensing the tension that pulsed through the air. One medic lowered himself slightly, hoping to show he meant no threat. But even that movement sent ripples of panic across the group. A mother stepped back so quickly her heel slipped on the frost, nearly dropping the bundle she was fighting to shield. Another pressed her child closer, turning her face away, as though eye contact alone might trigger the punishment she feared. Then a soft, thin cry broke through the stillness. The sound, fragile and strained, shattered whatever calm the women had tried to hold. It rose again, sharper this time, a baby's plea wrapped in hunger and cold. The mothers panicked, their eyes darting between the Americans and the child, terrified that the cry would draw unwanted attention. They rocked in place, shushing frantically, pleading under their breath for silence. The medics froze, not out of confusion, but out of understanding. This was no simple illness or exhaustion. The fear itself was the wound. It lived inside every hesitant step, every trembling hand, every desperate attempt to quiet a child who simply could not be hidden anymore. The doctors exchanged quiet glances, a shared realization settling between them. They were not just treating malnutrition or exposure. They were confronting a terror that medicine alone could not reach, a belief so deeply rooted that even kindness appeared dangerous. The doctor exhaled slowly, sensing that every step closer only tightened the fear around the women like a closing fist. So he did the one thing none of them expected. He stepped back. Not abruptly, not in defeat, but with a calm, intentional retreat that left a few feet of untouched space between himself and the cluster of trembling mothers. His boots pressed lightly into the frost as he moved, signaling that he would not force another inch. The air shifted almost immediately. The mothers, still holding their children tightly, felt the pressure loosen just enough for breath to settle deeper in their chests. Their shoulders lowered by a fraction, barely enough for anyone else to notice, yet meaningful in a place where every instinct urged them to guard, hide, and brace for the worst. The babies, sensing the softened tension, quieted into small, uneven breaths. No one moved for a long moment. The doctor stood with his hands loose at his sides, gaze steady but unthreatening, showing that he was willing to wait as long as it took. Behind him, the other medics followed his lead, taking a step back of their own, widening the invisible circle of safety forming around the women. They made no gestures toward the blankets they carried, no attempts to speak or coax. Stillness became the offering. In that pause, the camp's usual sound seemed to fall away. The rattle of distant equipment softened. The low murmur of guards faded. Even the wind eased as though the world itself understood the delicacy of the moment. The mothers remained curled protectively around their infants, but the rigidity in their posture slowly unwound, replaced by a cautious awareness of the space now gifted to them. Then, as though responding to something quiet and internal, one mother lifted her eyes. It was not a gesture of surrender or trust, only the smallest flicker of curiosity breaking through the shell of fear. Her gaze met the doctor's for a heartbeat, searching for signs of threat, judgment, or demand. She found none. He simply held her gaze with calm steadiness, offering nothing but presence. That brief connection passed like a fragile spark, quickly hidden again as she looked down, clutching her child close. But something had changed. The air no longer felt dangerous. The distance had become the first treatment, an unspoken assurance that not every approach meant harm, and not every intention carried a cost. A gust of wind swept across the yard, gentle but persistent, tugging lightly at the frayed edges of the blankets wrapped around the infants. One mother, weary from nights spent half sleeping and half guarding, adjusted her grip too late. The cloth loosened, slipping just enough for a small arm to emerge into the pale morning light. The doctor saw it instantly. Thin, delicate, marked by the quiet toll of long hunger and exhaustion. The child did not cry. It simply lay against its mother's chest with a stillness that spoke more loudly than any sound could. The mother hurried to cover the arm again, her fingers trembling as she tucked the blanket tight, her eyes wide with the fear of having revealed too much. The doctor felt the breath catch in his throat, but he did not allow the reaction to reach his face. Compassion had to move carefully here, without pity that might feel like judgment or concern that might be mistaken for condemnation. So he steadied his expression, lowering his gaze for a moment as if giving her permission to correct the blanket without scrutiny. Inside, however, he felt the ache deepen. This was not mere neglect or a lack of supplies. It was the quiet collapse of women who had tried to protect their children through every hardship the war delivered. They had hidden pregnancies, escaped bombed streets, crossed borders, and endured the desperation of captivity. Their bodies had given everything they could, and still it had not been enough. He looked at the mother again, noticing how she pressed the child close, her jaw tight, with the effort of appearing stronger than she felt. He understood then that her fear was not only for the baby. It was for the shame she believed would follow if anyone saw the evidence of struggle she had fought so hard to hide. The doctor kept his distance, letting the moment settle without intrusion. But the truth revealed in that brief slip of cloth stayed with him, tightening the sense of responsibility already pulling at his conscience. These children needed help. These mothers needed trust, and trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned with patience, humility, and restraint. The doctor returned to the supply crates without a word, signaling quietly to the medics who waited nearby. They understood immediately. No more attempts to offer items directly. No gestures that required the mothers to move closer or reveal what they were not yet ready to show. Instead, the men gathered blankets, small tins of formula, and warm cloths heated over a nearby stove. They carried them with the same care they might use for the wounded, but this time their steps were slower, gentler, almost reverent. They approached only halfway before stopping, lowering themselves to place the supplies on the cold ground. Each item was set down lightly, the sound barely more than a whisper. A stack of folded blankets rested near the mother's line, the steam rising faintly from the warmed cloth, inviting without insisting. Formula tins were arranged beside them, their lids loosened just enough to release a soft scent that drifted in the still air. Then, without waiting for a response, the medics stepped back again. The mothers froze. Their eyes locked on the supplies, their bodies rigid with caution. The distance between them and the items felt heavy, filled with the weight of every warning they had carried from their old lives. Accepting something could be a trap. Reaching forward might signal surrender or weakness. They stayed motionless, clutching their infants tightly, waiting for some command or hidden condition to reveal itself. But none came. The Americans said nothing. They made no motion to push the women forward or point toward the blankets. They simply waited, letting the cold morning settle around them all. The silence grew, not tense now, but curious, shaped by the possibility that maybe the offerings were exactly what they appeared to be. Help without expectation. Finally, one mother shifted. She moved slowly, as though wading through months of fear, her gaze never leaving the soldiers as she lowered herself toward a single folded blanket. Her hand trembled as she reached out, brushing the edge of the wool. When nothing happened, no orders, no reaction, no consequence, her fingers closed over it fully. That small act, quiet as it was, marked the first moment the camp breathed differently. The blanket that the first mother gathered around her child held warmth longer than she expected. She pressed it gently against the infant's back, feeling the tiny body relax by degrees. The trembling slow, the breath steadying into soft, uneven sighs. Around her, the other mothers watched in silence, their expressions taut with disbelief rather than relief. Yet the warmth spread, not only through the wool, but through the fragile space between them all. One of the formula tins, still warm from the stove, released a faint curl of steam. A second mother reached for it with hesitant fingers, her movements deliberate as she loosened the lid. The scent drifted upward, mild and unfamiliar, but undeniably nourishing. She tested a drop against her wrist, then brought it carefully to her baby's lips. The child suckled weakly at first, then with a sudden, determined rhythm born from long hunger. A small sound followed, not a cry of distress, but a soft whimper, the kind that came from a baby discovering comfort rather than fear. The mothers stiffened instinctively, expecting the sound to draw attention or provoke command. But nothing happened. The Americans remained several paces back, their posture steady, their eyes lowered in quiet respect for a moment that did not belong to them. Another infant stirred, and another mother eased closer to the supplies, taking a blanket with the same reverence she might show a relic. The babies responded one by one, breathing easier, shifting into the warmth, settling against their mothers' chests with a trust they had not shown since arriving in the camp. The women exchanged cautious glances, searching each other's faces for signs of danger, betrayal, or misunderstanding. Instead, they found a shared disbelief softening into something gentler. A few murmured quietly, not in fear this time, but in gratitude spoken almost too softly to hear. Hope did not appear all at once. It rose slowly, like warmth through wool, like steam curling into cold air, delicate and uncertain. But it rose. They began to speak only after the babies grew quiet, their small bodies warm and fed, no longer trembling in the cold. The mothers' voices stayed low, almost woven into the breath of the morning air, as though the stories they carried were too heavy to release all at once. Yet the act of holding their children without fear, if only for a moment, opened a door they had kept shut since the war first began to swallow everything familiar. One woman traced the edge of her blanket as she spoke, recalling how she had hidden her pregnancy through the final months of the collapsing front. She described wearing oversized coats, avoiding inspections, and slipping into abandoned cellars to muffle her labor pains. Another spoke of traveling mile after mile with her newborn pressed beneath her coat, terrified that even a single cry might draw soldiers from either side. They had learned early that appearing strong was not optional. It was survival. A mother who looked weak invited questions, and questions invited consequences. Their culture had taught them that shame followed those who faltered, and dishonor clung to women who revealed too much of their private suffering. So they stitched silence into their lives, carrying their infants as hidden burdens rather than the gifts they longed to celebrate. As they shared their stories, it became clear that their fear was not only of the Americans. It was of being seen, judged, or defined by what the war had forced upon them. They spoke of homes that no longer existed, of families scattered or lost, of identities stripped away until they were left holding only the children they had fought to keep alive. War had taken more than safety. It had taken the right to show tenderness without risking everything. Through the measured cadence of their voices, the doctor understood what their silence had protected, not secrets, but dignity. And now, with their babies breathing softly in their arms, they allowed pieces of themselves to surface. Fragile truths buried for survival, rising at last in the quiet that compassion had made possible. As the morning stretched into a softer light, the mothers found themselves caught between two realities. The one they had been taught to fear, and the one unfolding quietly before them. The warnings they carried from a fractured homeland had insisted that foreign soldiers would strip them of their dignity, their children, their safety. Yet nothing in the Americans' actions reflected those myths. No hands had reached to take. No voices had risen in command. No punishment had followed their trembling refusals. Instead, blankets had been placed gently on the ground. Formula had been warmed with care. Distance had been offered as respectfully as aid. Every gesture contradicted the stories that had shaped their terror. Where they expected harshness, they found patience. Where they anticipated judgment, they met steady calm. In the space created by these simple acts, the edges of fear began to soften. The doctor observed the change not with triumph, but with quiet understanding. He saw how the mother's shoulders no longer pressed upward in constant tension, how their eyes lingered on the supplies with less suspicion, how the babies breathed more peacefully under the warmth provided. Trust had not been earned fully, but something foundational had shifted. The symbols of that shift were small: blankets folded with care, tins of formula left within reach, the unhurried posture of men who refused to rush compassion. The myths that once held power over these women had been built on distance, on the unseen other, who could be shaped into whatever fear required. Now that the other stood several paces away, motionless and patient, the myths struggled to hold. In this emerging clarity, the mothers began to understand that some truths are revealed not through words, but through presence. The quiet endurance of kindness had begun to undo what fear had long controlled. And in that unraveling, a new understanding took root. Sometimes the greatest act of humanity is simply to stand back and let dignity return on its own. The sun rose higher, warming the frost-bitten ground until the air around the huts carried a faint shimmer of softness. The infants, full and wrapped in blankets that no longer felt like shields, but like gifts, rested easily against their mothers' chests. Their small breaths rose and fell in steady rhythms, a fragile chorus that softened even the harsh lines of the camp. For the first time in many months, these children slept, without the tension of being hidden, and their mothers held them without bracing for the sound of approaching boots. Across the yard, the American medics resumed their quiet routines, never intruding on the tender calm that had settled over the women. Their steps were steady, their voices low, as if aware that something delicate had formed, something that did not need explanation or recognition to hold meaning. The doctor paused occasionally to watch from a respectful distance, understanding that moments like this rarely made it into reports or records. Yet they shaped the moral landscape of war in ways numbers and strategies never could. This morning was only one among countless acts of quiet mercy scattered across the war's wreckage. In other camps, soldiers had shared rations they could barely spare. Nurses had tended to enemies with the same care as friends. Civilians had risked punishment to shelter those fleeing violence. These gestures rarely reached history books, yet they were the threads that kept humanity from splitting entirely under the weight of conflict. As the mothers sat together, the fear that had bound them for so long loosened, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of safety. They did not speak of myths or warnings now. They simply held their children close, letting warmth seep into the spaces where dread once lived. In the quiet of that late morning, the truth became clear: war divides, tearing lives apart with ruthless force. But humanity, expressed in patience, restraint, and simple acts of care has the power to mend what fear has broken. It was a mourning history nearly forgot, yet one in which healing quietly began.